Hello and welcome to Night 5 of First UCC's Bedtime Stories. We are going to be reading Chapter 5, The King's Fool, from the book The King's Messenger by Carolyn Clare Gibbons. We're going to start off with a poem called, or an excerpt from The Fool's Prayer by Edward Rowland Sill. Chapter 5, The King's Fool. The jester doffed his cap and bells, and stood the mocking court before. They could not see the bitter smile behind the painted grin he wore. He bowed his head and bent his knee upon the monarch's silken stool. His pleading voice arose, "O Lord, be merciful to me, a fool." Smuggins took his place in the line of messengers along the wall of the king's courtroom. Without moving his head, he glanced down and made sure that the new medal on his shoulder was shining brightly. The whole kingdom knew of Smuggins's part in the campaign against the king's enemy, and these days, as he walked down the street, he overheard people talking about him. "There he is! That's Smuggins! The messenger that the king sent to the north? Yes, he's the one that went with barely any training at all and struck a crippling blow to the king's enemy. How brave he must be! And look how he takes up his duties as a messenger again, without a hint of disdain. Well, a messenger for the king isn't so bad after all." Smuggins was glad that the whole kingdom knew his name and his deeds. He was proud of his role in the fight against the enemy. And now he stood straight and tall in the line along the wall, ready to step forward and speak the words he knew so well. "At your service, your majesty. Yes, your majesty." That morning a strange visitor came to the king's courtroom. He wore a cap laden with bells and a tunic of bright colors. His feet were shod in slippers that had bells on the toes, which jingled when he moved. He was a small man, lithe and graceful, each movement like a step in a dance. Over one shoulder he was slung a bag that gaped, revealing balls and gourds painted the colors of jewels. Hung on his other shoulder he carried a musical instrument, shaped like a teardrop with strings leading up a short neck. He entered the king's presence without ceremony, but bowed low before the throne as he approached. "Good sir," the visitor said, his voice pure and lilting, "I am not often in your kingdom, but in my journey here have found myself pleased with the land. I wonder if I may offer you my services for a time. I excel in little but few jests and tunes, but in the past I have been able to please great men of other lands with my words and music. I am a traveler, and do not well stay long in a place. But if you'll have me, I would spend a few days in your presence. I hope to brighten what time I spend with you." Smuggins had heard of traveling jesters and minstrels, but had never seen one before with his own eyes. Most were not much more than vagrants, wandering from place to place and begging favor with their small skills. This one seemed a little bit more respectable than the stories, but one never knew. After all, he hadn't even addressed the king as "Your Majesty." Surely, Smuggins thought, surely the king will send him packing. But to Smuggins' surprise, the king smiled at the outlandish jester. "I would like to see some brighter days, for these are dark times for my kingdom. Good sir, you may stay a few days. You will be housed and fed and given a gift upon your departure to keep you until you find another court." "The king is kind. I thank you." The jester made a graceful bow before the throne. "Misha," the king called out. "At your service, your majesty," Misha said, stepping forward. "Please lead this gentleman to the guest wing and have the housekeeper find him a room to sleep in." "Yes, your majesty," Misha replied, and she quietly led the jester from the king's courtroom. That night, the messengers gathered for their evening meal after the day of service in the king's courtroom. As usual, the events of the day, the visitors, and the activities of the king's courtroom were the first topic of conversation. Fairly soon, the discussion settled upon the day's oddest arrival. Chester, Moggins shorted. He must have thought we needed a little levity in our kingdom. I, for one, think he's quite out of place, Figgins replied. I don't know why he would come all this way simply to tell a few jokes and sing a few songs. I think it's disrespectful to the king's presence. I agree, said Onegins. At a time like this, with the king's enemy regrouping in the north, the last thing we need is a distraction. The king should be focused on battle plans, bringing in generals and warriors. Instead, he invites a fool to share his table. Misha broke in, her voice quavering. Onegins? He is the king. He can invite whomever he desires to his table. Onegins looked somewhat chastened, and quickly turned the discussion to a tradesman he had taken to the royal prince's palace that afternoon. Smuggins found little to interest him in the tradesman, and began to think back over what had been said. Misha was correct, of course. She usually was. However, Smuggins had fought the king's enemy himself. He knew that the man was not to be underestimated. He knew firsthand the danger that the king's enemy posed. It was not good for the king to take his eyes off of him for one moment. The next day, as the messenger stood in a line along the side of the king's courtroom, the king called forth the strange visitor and asked him for entertainment. The man first reached into his bag and pulled out the brightly colored balls. He began to juggle them in the air, throwing them up and catching them again, always keeping them moving. As he juggled, he bent again and picked up a painted gourd, adding it to the flying objects without missing a beat. One by one, he added all the gourds until his bag was empty, and the air in front of him was shaded with a blur of jewel tones. After a while, again without a pause, he began to drop the objects back into his bag beside him until there was only a ball the color of rubies left in his hand. Those in the courtroom who had watched this talent without making a noise erupted into applause. The king laughed aloud and clasped his hands. "My good sir," the king said as the room quieted, "I have never seen the like." "I thank you, my lord," the entertainer replied. "May I give a gift to one of your messengers, sir?" "Of course," the king answered. The gesture moved quickly toward the line of messengers, still holding the ruby-red ball in his hand. He came to stop in front of Misha. He twisted his hand as if by magic. Suddenly the ball disappeared, and in its place he held a red rose. "For the kind lady who showed me to my room," the jester said, presenting it to her. Misha blushed and timidly took it from him. "Thank you," she said. "It smells lovely." The jester bowed his head to her and then turned back to the king. "And now, my lord, I hope that I may entertain further. I have a story to tell you of a great giant." The jester's tale was long and winding, but each turn was funnier than the one before it. The entire courtroom was laughing by the end, and the king sat in his throne, holding his sides and shedding tears from laughing so hard. Even Smuggins had to smile at the jester's story, but he saw that Onegins managed to look dour the whole way through. Onegins thought the jokes and magic tricks and juggling were below the notice of a king's messenger, and Smuggins was not sure he was wrong. That night, when the messengers gathered for their meal, Misha was not among them. They began without her, but she arrived only a few minutes late with a jester beside her. I have invited our visitor to join us for a meal," Misha said, and made a place for the jester at the table. Tradition held that any guest at the messenger's table had to be welcomed, but it did not specify the manner in which they were to do so. Onegins, as a senior messenger, stood when the jester sat and spoke to him. "Sir," he said, his voice tinged with sarcasm, "I hope our table will not be too humble for you. We thank you for your entertainment today. I hope that we do not bore you. We are only the messengers of the king and are not as colorful or as flamboyant as you. Onegins, Coggins said in a warning tone, this man is Misha's guest. Onegins turned to Misha. Then I beg your forgiveness for my rudeness. I am glad that you thought to brighten our table with a foolish wanderer who serves no one but himself. I, however, serve the king, and you'll forgive me if my duties to attend to. He stood and left the table. Smuggins watched him go and then glanced at the gesture. The man did not seem hurt by Onegins' words, but continued to eat the meal placed in front of him. After dinner, when the messengers had scattered, and the jester had returned to his room, Misha found Smuggins in the courtyard. I only wanted him to feel welcome in our home, she said, a tear falling down her cheek. Smuggins took her hand to comfort her, but had to say what he was thinking. Why? Do you really think he should feel welcome here? He's only going to leave again. We're messengers for the king. It's an important job. He's a restless, foolish wanderer who tells a good tale. I understand why Onegins was angry. Misha pulled her hand out from his and stood up. Oh, Smuggins, she said, I don't think you understand anything. With that, she left him alone. The next morning, the king asked the minstrel for a song. The man picked up his instrument, and after tuning it, sat for a moment deciding what to play. But before we get there, here's an illustration of Misha and the jester. Jester. I really struggle with that word. Smuggins saw him look toward the wall of the messengers. He didn't try to disguise the expression on his face. He wanted the minstrel to know he didn't approve. Then the minstrel looked back to the king with a question in his eyes. The king nodded, and the minstrel smiled before he began to play and sing these words to the king. I've been instructed what the tune of this song would be by the author of the book, so I've decided to sing it for you. Allison, that's my dog, not part of the book. Do not get into anything, okay? No. There is nothing I can give, only by your gift I live. Under your law I delight, serve you all the day and night. The music of his instrument was beautiful, and his voice carried the haunting tune well. There was an earnestness in the man's eyes and voice. There is nothing I can give, only by your gift I live, the man had sung. The words struck Smuggins. How many times in recent weeks had he prided himself on his actions in the battle against the enemy, yet even at the time he'd known his task was only a small part of the plan. The minstrel's demeanor made Smuggins question all of his assumptions. Perhaps the fool was not so foolish after all. The king smiled at the song and looked over at the line of messengers. Seeing similar looks on the faces of Smuggins and Onegins, he called them forward. At your service, your majesty! At your service, your majesty! They said, both stepping forth. Onegins, the king said, I see you look confused. I believe, your majesty, that I misjudged this minstrel. I see by the earnest look in his eyes that he sings truth. I do not understand how, but I believe he truly does live to serve you as much as I do. That is so, the king said. In fact, in a way, he is a messenger as well. I have known this minstrel for many years, and it is at my bidding that he goes to the courts of great men the world over, to share his gifts and the goodwill of our kingdom. I asked him to come here and pretend to be a stranger. We can all learn something from his humility. A messenger? Onegins was surprised. I've never seen such a messenger. Smuggins, the king said. Your face shows as much confusion as a niggin's." "Your Majesty," Smuggins answered, "I thought this man was a foolish jester. I looked down on him for that, and I was glad I wasn't like him." Smuggins looked down at the medal on his chest. "I've been very proud of myself lately. Not proud to serve you, proud of what I've done. But I think perhaps, foolish as he seems, this jester understands serving you better than I do." "That he may," the king answered, standing. He came to face the line of messengers. "You see, the foolish things of this world can shame the wise." And that ends the reading of chapter 5. Tune in for chapter 6 tomorrow. I hope that you all are having a good week. I hope that you can connect with your families, and I hope that all of you children are having plenty of time to do games, to run outside, to take walks. But I encourage you all to stay safe. And I also encourage you all to spend this time together. Take advantage of this time. Pray. Spend quality time together. Read something of substance. Listen to these bedtime stories and make the most out of this time. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to sharing chapter 6 with you, titled The King's Forgiveness, tomorrow.